mind. 1 minute. In the first minute following her death, Tequila Layla's consciousness began to ebb, slowly and steadily, like a tide receding from the shore. Her brain cells, having run out of blood, were now completely deprived of oxygen. But they did not shut down. Not right away. One last reserve of energy activated countless neurons, connecting them as though for the first time. Although her heart had stopped beating, her brain was resisting, a fighter till the end. It entered into a state of heightened awareness, observing the demise of the body but not ready to accept its own end. Her memory surged forth, eager and diligent, collecting pieces of a life that was speeding to a close. She recalled things she did not even know she was capable of remembering, things she had believed to be lost forever. Time became fluid, a fast flow of recollections seeping into one another, the past and the present inseparable. The first memory that came to her mind was about salt, the feel of it on her skin and the taste of it on her tongue. She saw herself as a baby, naked, slick and red. Only a few seconds earlier she had left her mother's womb and slid through a wet, slippery passage, gripped by a fear wholly new to her, and here she was now in a room full of sounds and colors and things unknown. Sunlight through the stained glass windows dappled the quilt on the bed and reflected off the water in a porcelain basin, despite it being a chilly day in January. Into that same water an elderly woman dressed in shades of autumn leaves, the midwife, dipped a towel and wrung it out, blood trickling down her forearm. Mashallah, mashallah. It's a girl. The midwife took a piece of flint, which she had tucked away in her bra, and cut the umbilical cord. She never used a knife or a pair of scissors for this purpose, finding their cold efficiency unsuitable to the messy task of welcoming a baby into this world. The old woman was widely respected in the neighborhood, and considered, for all her eccentricities and reclusiveness, to be one of the uncanny ones, those who had two sides to their personality, one earthly, one unearthly, and who, like a coin tossed into the air, could at any time reveal either face. A girl, echoed the young mother lying in the wrought iron four-poster bed, her honey brown hair matted with sweat, her mouth dry as sand. She had been worried that this might be so. Earlier in the month she had taken a walk in the garden looking for spider webs in the branches overhead, and, when she had found one, she had gently pushed her finger through it. For several days afterwards, she had checked the site. If the spider had repaired the hole, it would mean that the baby was a boy. But the web had remained torn. The young woman's name was Benaz 1000 blandishments. She was 19 years of age, though this year she felt much older. She had full, generous lips, a dainty, upturned nose that was considered a rarity in this part of the country, a long face with a pointed chin, and large, dark eyes speckled with blue flecks like a starling's eggs. She had always been slender and of delicate build, but now looked even more so in her fawn-colored linen nightgown. There were a few faint smallpox scars on her cheeks. Her mother had once said they were a sign that she had been caressed by moonlight in her sleep. She missed her mother and her father and her 9 siblings, all of whom lived in a village several hours away. Her family were very poor, a fact she had often been reminded of ever since she had entered this house as a new bride. Be thankful. When you came here, you had nothing. She still had nothing. Benaz often thought, all her possessions were as ephemeral and rootless as dandelion seeds. One stiff breeze, one torrential downpour, and they would be gone, just like that. It weighed heavily on her mind that she could be thrown out of this house at any time, and if that happened, where would she go? Her father would never agree to take her back, not with so many mouths to feed. She would have to marry again, but there was no guarantee that her next marriage would be any happier or a new husband more to her liking. And who would want her anyway, a divorcee, a used woman? Burdened with these suspicions, she moved around the house, around her bedroom, around her own head, like an uninvited guest. That is, until now. Everything would be different with the birth of this baby, she assured herself. She would no longer feel ill at ease, no longer insecure, almost against her will. Benaz glanced towards the doorway. There, with one hand on her hip, another on the door handle, as if debating whether to stay or leave, stood a sturdy-looking, square-jawed woman. Although she was in her early 40s, the age spots on her hands and the creases around her blade-thin mouth made her appear older. Across her forehead there were deep lines, uneven and magnified, like a plowed field. Her wrinkles came mostly from frowning and smoking. All day long she puffed away on tobacco smuggled in from Iran and sipped tea smuggled in from Syria. Her brick-red hair, thanks to generous applications of Egyptian henna, was parted in the middle and formed into a perfect plait that almost reached her waist. Her hazel eyes she had carefully lined with the darkest kohl. She was Benaz's husband's other wife, the first one, Suzanne. For an instant, the two women locked gazes. The air around them felt thick and slightly yeasty, like rising dough. They had been sharing the same room for more than 12 hours and yet now they were thrust into separate worlds. They both knew that with the birth of this child their positions in the family would shift forever. The second wife, despite her youth and recent arrival, would be promoted to the top. Suzanne averted her eyes, but not for long. When she looked back, there was a hardness in her face that hadn't been there before. She nodded towards the baby. Why doesn't she make a sound? Benaz turned ashen. Yes. Is there something wrong? Nothing's wrong, said the midwife, giving Suzanne a cold glare. We just have to wait. The midwife rinsed the baby with holy water from the Zamzam well, courtesy of a pilgrim who had recently returned from the Hajj. The blood, the mucus, the vernix were all wiped away. The newborn squirmed uncomfortably and kept on squirming even after the washing, as though fighting with herself, all 8 pounds 3 ounces of her. Can I hold her? Asked Benaz, twirling her hair between her fingertips, an anxious habit she had picked up over the past year. She's not crying. Oh, she will cry, this girl, said the midwife in a decisive tone, and instantly bit her tongue, the statement echoing like a dark omen. Quickly, she spat on the floor 3 times and stepped on her left foot with her right one. That would prevent the premonition, if that's what it was, from traveling far. An awkward silence ensued as everyone in the room, the first wife, the second wife, the midwife and 2 neighbors, stared at the baby with expectant eyes. What is it? Tell me the truth, said Benaz to no one in particular, her voice thinner than air. Having had 6 miscarriages in only a few years, each more devastating than the last and harder to forget, she had been extremely careful throughout this pregnancy. She had not touched a single peach so the baby wouldn't be covered in fuzz. She had not used any spices or herbs in her cooking so the baby wouldn't have freckles or moles. She had not smelled roses so the baby wouldn't have porcine birthmarks. Not even once had she cut her hair lest their luck also be cut short. She had refrained from hammering nails into the wall in case she mistakenly hit a sleeping ghoul on the head. After dark, knowing too well that the jinn held their weddings around toilets, she had stayed in her room, making do with a chamber pot. Rabbits, rats, cats, vultures, porcupines, strayed dogs. She had managed to avoid looking at them all. Even when a roving musician had appeared on their street with a dancing bear in tow, and all the locals had flocked outside to watch the spectacle, she had refused to join them, fearing her baby would emerge covered in hair. And whenever she had run into a beggar or a leper, or seen a hearse, she had turned around and scurried off in the opposite direction. Every morning she had eaten a whole quince to give the baby dimples, and every night she had slept with a knife under her pillow to ward off evil spirits. And secretly, after every sunset, she had collected hairs from Suzanne's hairbrush and burned them in the fireplace so as to reduce the power of her husband's first wife. As soon as the birth pangs had started, Benaz had bitten into a red apple, sweet and sun-softened. It now stood on the table by her bed, slowly browning. This same apple would later be sliced into several pieces and given to women in the neighborhood who could not get pregnant, so they too might one day bear a child. She had also sipped pomegranate sherbet that had been poured into her husband's right shoe, scattered fennel seeds in 4 corners of the room and jumped over a broom placed on the floor, just by the door, a frontier to keep shaitan away. As the cramps intensified, one by one, all the caged animals in the house were released to facilitate the labor. The canaries, the finches, the last to be freed was the better fish in the glass bowl, proud and lonely. Now it must be swimming in a creek not far away, its long, flowing fins as blue as a fine sapphire. If the little fish reached the Soda Lake, for which this eastern Anatolian town was famous, it would not have much chance of survival in the salty, carbonated waters. But if it traveled the opposite way, it could reach the Great Zab, and, somewhere further down the journey, it might even join the Tigris, that legendary river issuing out of the Garden of Eden. All of this for the baby to arrive safe and healthy. I want to see her. Can you bring me my daughter? No sooner had Benaz asked this than a movement caught her attention. Quiet as a passing thought, Suzanne had opened the door and slipped outside, no doubt to give the news to her husband, their husband. Benaz's whole frame went rigid. Haroun was a man of scintillating opposites. Remarkably generous and charitable one day, self-absorbed and distracted to the point of callousness the next. The oldest of 3, he had raised his 2 siblings on his own after their parents had died in a car accident that had destroyed their world. The tragedy had shaped his personality, making him overprotective of his family and distrustful of outsiders. At times he recognized that something was broken inside him and he dearly wished he could mend it, but these thoughts never led him anywhere. He was fond of alcohol and fearful of religion in equal degree. Knocking back yet another glass of raki, he would make hefty promises to his drinking buddies, and afterwards, when he sobered up, heavy with guilt, he would make even heftier promises to Allah. While his mouth may have been hard for him to control, his body proved a greater challenge still. Every time Benaz had got pregnant, his belly, too, had swollen in tandem with hers. Not much, but enough to make the neighbors snigger behind his back. The man is expecting again, they said, rolling their eyes. Too bad he can't give birth himself. Haroun wanted a son more than anything in the world. Not just one. He told whoever cared to listen that he was going to have 4 sons, whom he was going to name Tarkan, Tolga, Dufan, and Tariq. FN1 His long years of marriage to Suzanne had yielded no offspring. The elders in the family had then found Benaz, a girl of barely 16. After weeks of negotiations between the families, Haroun and Benaz had married in a religious ceremony. It was unofficial, and if anything were to go wrong in the future it would not be recognized by the secular courts, but that was a detail no one had cared to mention. The 2 of them had sat on the floor, in front of the witnesses, opposite the cross-eyed imam whose voice became more gravelly as he switched from Turkish to Arabic. Benaz had kept her gaze on the carpet throughout, although she could not help stealing glances at the imam's feet. His socks, pale brown like baked mud, were old and worn. Every time he shifted, one of his big toes threatened to push through the threadbare wool, looking for an escape. Soon after the wedding Benaz had got pregnant, but it had ended in a miscarriage that almost killed her. Late night panic, hot shards of pain, a cold hand gripping her groin, the smell of blood, the need to hold on to something, as if she were falling. It had been the same with each subsequent pregnancy, only worse. She could not tell anyone, but it seemed to her that with each baby lost, another part of the rope bridge linking her to the world at large had snapped and fallen away, until only the flimsiest thread kept her connected to that world, kept her sane. After 3 years of waiting, the family elders had once again started pressuring Haroun. They reminded him that the Quran allows a man to have up to 4 wives, so long as he was fair to them, and they had no doubt that Haroun would treat all his wives equally. They urged him to look for a peasant woman this time, even a widow with children of her own. It, too, wouldn't be official, but it could easily be done through another religious ceremony, just as quiet and quick as the previous one. Alternatively, he could divorce this useless young wife and then get remarried. So far, Harun had turned down both suggestions. It was hard enough providing for 2 wives, he said, a third would ruin him financially, and he had no intention of leaving either Suzanne or Benaz, both of whom he had grown fond of, though for different reasons. Now, as she propped herself up on the pillows, Benaz tried to imagine what Harun was doing. He must be lying on a sofa in the next room, one hand on his forehead, another on his stomach, expecting a baby's cry to pierce the air. Then she imagined Suzanne walking towards him, her steps measured, controlled. She saw them together, whispering to each other, their gestures smooth and practiced, shaped by years of sharing the same space, even if not the same bed. Unsettled by her own thoughts, Benaz said, more to herself than to anyone else, Suzanne is telling him. That's all right, said one of the neighbors soothingly. So much was insinuated in this remark. Let her be the one who delivers the news of the baby she herself could not deliver. Unspoken words ran between the women of this town like washing lines strung between houses. Benaz nodded even as she felt something dark brewing inside her, an anger she had never let out. She glanced at the midwife and asked, why has the baby still not made a sound?